The courtroom was unnervingly quiet. The judge, gavel raised and suspended mid-air, looked at the teenager standing in the witness box. The silence was deafening. Ethan Parker, only 15, had just made a decision that stunned everyone, from the judge to the lawyers to the spectators. He had withdrawn his testimony. I can't do this," Ethan had said, his voice soft yet resolute. The words struck the room like a bolt of lightning, shattering the calm of the court. Even Robert Langford, the defendant sitting at the table, stared in shock, his eyes wide, mouth slightly open. The air in the room crackled with confusion. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Lawyers whispered frantically among themselves, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. Spectators exchanged puzzled glances, unsure what had driven a 15-year-old to challenge the course of the trial. "Mr. Parker," Judge Richard Hamilton said, his voice calm but edged with disbelief, "do you understand the seriousness of your actions?" Ethan stood tall, his demeanor calm yet determined. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand." The murmurs in the room grew louder, as people tried to process what was happening. Ethan had been a crucial witness in the case, but his sudden change of heart left everyone in suspense. What could he possibly have to say? And why had he done this? A moment of tense silence followed before the judge spoke again, his voice more commanding this time. "Mr. Parker, you've testified under oath. You cannot simply withdraw your testimony without a valid reason. This court demands an explanation." Ethan hesitated, his hands shaking slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Your Honor, I didn't lie. I didn't know everything. I thought I saw something, but now I realize I missed something important." Judge Hamilton raised an eyebrow, clearly perplexed. "Explain." Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was the moment when everything would change. The trial had been building to this point, and now, the truth he was about to reveal could turn everything upside down. "I'm not sure how to explain it," Ethan began. "I thought I saw everything clearly that day, but something's been bothering me. I didn't pay close enough attention. I missed a detail that could change everything. I know it sounds strange, but I can't let Mr. Langford take the fall for something that wasn't his fault." A wave of confusion rippled through the room. No one knew exactly what Ethan was referring to, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The judge glanced at the attorneys, who were just as baffled. This sudden turn in the case was unexpected, and no one knew what would come next. For the people in the room, this was just the beginning of a much bigger story. A story that began several weeks earlier in a small suburban town called Willowbrook. Ethan Parker was an average high school sophomore, but there was something special about him. He wasn't the star athlete, nor was he the top student, but he had something that many others lacked: a quiet kindness. Ethan wasn't the type of kid who wanted attention. He was the one who held the door open for others, the one who remembered birthdays, even when the parents had forgotten. His kindness went largely unnoticed by most people, but that would change on one fateful day. It started with a car accident. Ethan was biking home from school when he saw it happen. A red SUV sped through the intersection of Maple Street and Pine Avenue, colliding with an old sedan that was turning into the intersection. The crash was violent, sending the sedan spinning out of control. The driver of the sedan, an older man, stumbled out of his car and collapsed onto the pavement, clutching his chest in pain. The driver of the SUV, a woman in a sharp business suit, was already on the phone, her face a mask of annoyance. Without thinking, Ethan dropped his bike and ran toward the man. "Are you okay, sir?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking. The man, whose name was Robert Langford, looked up weakly. "I'm fine. Just "Give me a minute," he muttered, his breath labored and his face pale. Ethan didn't know much about first aid, but he stayed by Robert's side, holding his hand and offering what comfort he could. When the paramedics arrived, Ethan felt a strange tug in his chest. There was something about the accident that didn't sit right with him, but he couldn't figure out what. That night, he replayed the events in his mind over and over again. It was like a puzzle, one piece just out of place. A week later, Ethan's mother, Sarah, received a subpoena in the mail. Ethan was listed as a witness to the accident. The woman driving the SUV, Linda Carter, was claiming that Robert Langford had caused the crash by running a red light. But Ethan knew better. He remembered the sequence clearly. It was Linda who had run the light, not Robert. "I have to testify," Ethan told his mother that night. Sarah frowned, concerned. "Are you sure, Ethan? Court cases can be complicated. You're just a kid. You shouldn't have to deal with all this stress." "I know, Mom," Ethan replied, "but I have to. Robert doesn't deserve to be blamed for something he didn't do." Despite her reservations, Sarah knew there was no changing Ethan's mind. Her son was stubborn when it came to doing what he thought was right. And so, Ethan found himself in the courtroom, sitting quietly, clutching a notebook filled with every detail he could remember from the accident. The atmosphere was intimidating, but Ethan stayed focused. He would tell the truth, no matter the consequences. When his turn to testify came, he felt his heart race. But as he spoke, his words were clear. "I know what I saw," Ethan said firmly. "I know that Robert Langford didn't cause the crash. It was the other driver who was at fault." But as the days went by and more evidence came forward, things began to spiral. The case wasn't as straightforward as Ethan had thought. People began questioning his memory. Was he sure? Was he old enough to be trusted? Ethan didn't waver. He knew what he saw, and he wouldn't back down. Ethan Parker was never the type of person who sought attention. He didn't want to stand out. In fact, if you asked most people at Willowbrook High about him, they'd say he was quiet, a bit reserved, and someone who did his best to blend in. He wasn't a star athlete, nor was he the most academically gifted student. He didn't have the perfect body or a group of loyal friends always by his side. But there was something about him that set him apart, even if most people didn't realize it. His heart. Ethan had an undeniable kindness that was often overlooked in a world obsessed with winners and accolades. He was the student who, every morning, would hold the door open for classmates, even if they didn't say thank you. He was the one who quietly passed notes to his friends during lunch, reminding them of upcoming tests or birthdays. He was the first to offer help with homework without being asked, and the last to leave the classroom, helping his teacher carry books or set up for the next day. His kindness wasn't loud. It was the kind of quiet generosity that often went unnoticed. Ethan was content with his life. He didn't feel the need to be the center of attention. He was content to live in the background, offering small gestures of kindness that, while sometimes unnoticed, made a difference to those around him. He had his friends, Ryan Matthews, for example, who shared his love for video games and was always there to support Ethan in the rare moments when he doubted himself. But even Ryan had no idea just how deep Ethan's sense of kindness ran. That all changed one warm spring afternoon. Ethan was biking home from school, his mind occupied with the thought of his upcoming history exam. As he pedaled down Maple Street, he passed the intersection where Pine Avenue met. Without warning, his attention was pulled to the sight of a red SUV speeding into the intersection. The old sedan in front of it was already making a left turn, but the SUV didn't slow down in time. The crash was violent. The sedan spun out of control, its hood crumpling as it was hit. The red SUV, swerving uncontrollably, skidded to a stop. Ethan's heart raced. Without thinking, he dropped his bike and sprinted towards the accident. The first thing he noticed was the driver of the sedan, an older man in his late 50s, looking pale and disoriented. He stumbled out of the car, clutching his chest, gasping for breath. Ethan didn't stop to assess the damage. He just acted. "Are you okay, sir?" he asked, his voice shaking with urgency. The man, Robert Langford, nodded weakly, but said nothing. His face was ashen, his breathing shallow. I'm fine. Just give me a minute," he muttered, though his unsteady legs betrayed the severity of the situation. Ethan glanced at the other driver, the woman in the red SUV. She was already on her phone, presumably calling the police. Ethan could tell that she wasn't concerned about the accident. Her annoyance at the delay was evident. She didn't even make eye contact with him as he crouched beside Robert, offering him his hand. Ethan stayed with Robert, offering words of comfort, even though he didn't really know if they'd help. He didn't know what was going on in the older man's body, but he felt a strange connection to him, a sense that something about this accident wasn't just an ordinary mishap. The man was hurt, yes, but there was something deeper at play. When the paramedics arrived, Ethan reluctantly stood back, watching as they loaded Robert into the ambulance. He didn't know why, but a part of him felt as though the situation was more than just a random accident. It was a moment of fate. Something bigger was at work here, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that it would somehow involve him. It wasn't until a week later that Ethan learned just how much it would involve him. His mother, Sarah, had received a letter from the courthouse, informing them that Ethan had been listed as a witness to the accident. The legal dispute was growing, and Ethan's account was suddenly crucial. The woman driving the SUV, Linda Carter, was claiming that Robert had run a red light, causing the crash. But Ethan knew better. He had seen it all. He had watched Linda speed through the intersection, her eyes fixed on her phone, not the road. It had been her fault, not Robert's. "I have to testify," Ethan told his mother, his voice unwavering. Sarah frowned, clearly worried. "Ethan, I don't know if this is the best thing for you. Court cases can be messy, and you're just a kid. It's going to be stressful. You don't have to do this." "I know, Mom," Ethan replied, "but I can't let Robert take the blame. He didn't do anything wrong." Sarah sighed, knowing Ethan wouldn't back down. Her son had always been determined, especially when it came to standing up for what he believed in. She wasn't sure how this would all unfold, but she knew that once Ethan made up his mind, there was no changing it. The next morning, Ethan was thrust into the intimidating world of the courthouse. The atmosphere was starkly different from anything he had experienced before. The polished wood, the towering bookshelves, and the stern expressions of everyone present made him feel small. Robert Langford sat at the defendant's table, looking tired and defeated. His lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman, was speaking in hushed tones to him, trying to maintain some semblance of hope. Ethan sat quietly, clutching a notebook where he had carefully written down every detail he could remember about the accident. He wasn't sure how this would go, but he was determined to do what was right. It was his turn to testify the following day. Ethan's heart raced as he took the stand, his hands trembling slightly. The opposing attorney, a sharp woman in a business suit, immediately began questioning him. "You're 15, correct?" the lawyer asked, pacing in front of him. "You're telling this court that you remember the sequence of events clearly?" "Yes," Ethan replied firmly, looking her directly in the eyes. "I remember." The lawyer smirked, as though she didn't believe him. 15, she repeated, as if the number alone made Ethan's words unreliable. "Not exactly the age of a seasoned observer. Wouldn't you agree?" Ethan flushed, but he held his ground. "I know what I saw." The questioning continued for hours, with both sides trying to poke holes in his testimony. By the time he left the stand, Ethan was exhausted. But he had said what needed to be said. He had told the truth. And now he couldn't turn back. As the days in court passed, Ethan began to realize that the case was becoming far more complicated than he had initially expected. The opposing attorney, a sharp woman named Victoria Hartwell, was relentless in her pursuit of discrediting his testimony. Every word Ethan said was scrutinized, twisted, and turned against him. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, and the stakes were growing higher. Ethan tried his best to remain calm under pressure. He had always been a quiet and reserved kid, but now, with all eyes on him, he found himself tested like never before. As the trial dragged on, the pressure mounted. The opposing lawyer seemed determined to break him, to make him doubt his own memory of the events. But Ethan wasn't swayed. He knew what he had seen that day, and he wasn't going to let anyone tell him otherwise. Robert Langford, the man at the center of it all, sat at the defendant's table with his head bowed. He looked worn out, defeated, as if the years of legal battles had finally taken their toll. His lawyer, a woman named Claudia Rogers, was doing her best to defend him, but it seemed like the odds were stacked against them. Every new piece of evidence brought into court painted Robert in a less favorable light. A history of reckless driving was brought up, 2 minor accidents from years ago. Witnesses came forward, contradicting Ethan's account, claiming that the traffic light had turned red before Robert entered the intersection. Ethan felt the sting of doubt beginning to creep into his mind, but he fought it back. He knew what he had seen. The woman in the red SUV had run the light, not Robert. As the case grew more complicated, Ethan's resolve only hardened. He refused to let Robert Langford be blamed for something he didn't do, but even he couldn't deny the mounting pressure. The more the defense tried to prove Robert's guilt, the more Ethan felt as though the truth was slipping further away. On the final day of the trial, just as the judge was about to prepare to deliver his verdict, Ethan made a decision that would change everything. He had spent the entire night replaying the accident in his mind, analyzing every detail, trying to piece together what had happened. And then, as the sun rose, he knew what he had to do. It was now or never. As the judge prepared to give his final ruling, Ethan stood up in the middle of the courtroom, his legs trembling slightly. His heart pounded in his chest, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "I need to say something." The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to him. The judge, clearly taken aback, raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Parker, you've already testified. This isn't the time for additional statements." But Ethan interrupted him, his voice rising with urgency. "Please, Your Honor, it's important." Judge Hamilton hesitated for a moment, looking over at the opposing attorney, who gave a subtle nod. "Very well. Proceed, Mr. Parker." Ethan took a deep breath and said the words that no one had expected. "I'm withdrawing my testimony." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and even Robert's lawyer, Claudia Rogers, turned to stare at Ethan, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. The judge's face hardened, a mixture of confusion and frustration settling in. "Mr. Parker, explain yourself," the judge demanded, his voice sharp. "You swore under oath that your testimony was truthful. Are you suggesting you lied to this court?" Ethan's hands trembled, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "No, Your Honor, I didn't lie. But I can't let Mr. Langford take the fall for something he didn't do. There's more to this than I originally thought. I didn't see everything the way I should have." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, but Ethan stood his ground. "I know I didn't see everything, but I'm not going to stand by while someone is wrongly accused. I can't explain everything yet, but I know there's more to this case than what's been presented." The judge's expression darkened. Are you suggesting you withheld evidence from this court during your initial testimony? He asked, his voice growing sharp. Ethan swallowed hard. This was it. I didn't know everything at the time, but I do now, and I have to say the truth. The room was still, every single person waiting for the next words to come from Ethan's mouth. Even Robert seemed frozen in disbelief. Claudia Rogers stood up, looking as though she wanted to object, but the judge silenced her with a raised hand. Mr. Parker, do you understand the gravity of what you're doing? Judge Hamilton asked, his voice softening but still carrying the weight of his authority. Withdrawing your testimony could have serious consequences, not just for this trial, but for you as well. False testimony, whether intentional or not, is a serious offense. Ethan nodded. I understand, Your Honor, but I'm willing to face the consequences if it means doing what's right. The judge sat back in his chair, the tension in the room palpable. After a long moment of contemplation, he finally spoke. This is highly irregular. We'll take a short recess to deliberate on how to proceed. The courtroom was filled with the sound of movement as people began to file out, but the buzz of excitement and confusion lingered. What had just happened? Why had Ethan withdrawn his testimony? Outside the courtroom, Ethan sat on the edge of a bench in the hallway, his head in his hands. His mother, Sarah, paced nervously nearby, her heels clicking against the hard floor. Ethan, Sarah said softly, sitting down next to him. What's going on? Why did you do that? Ethan looked up, guilt and determination in his eyes. I couldn't let it go, Mom. Something felt wrong, and last night I remembered something. What did you remember? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Ethan hesitated. He had kept this detail to himself, unsure if it would matter. But now he knew it had to be said. The woman in the SUV, Linda Carter. She wasn't looking at the road. She was looking at something on the passenger seat. That's why she swerved. It wasn't because the light was red. It was because she wasn't paying attention. Sarah's eyes widened. Are you sure? Ethan nodded, his voice firm. I didn't say anything before because I wasn't sure if it mattered. But now I know it does. The tension in the courtroom was thick when they returned from recess. Ethan Parker's unexpected decision to withdraw his testimony had everyone on edge, including the judge, the attorneys, and the spectators. As they filed back into their seats, murmurs of disbelief filled the room. Everyone was waiting for Ethan to explain why he had taken such a drastic step and what it meant for the case. Ethan's mind was still racing. What he had revealed about Linda Carter, the driver of the red SUV, wasn't just a minor detail. It had the potential to unravel everything. He had seen it clearly now. The distraction, the object on the passenger seat that had taken her attention away from the road. But could anyone else see it the way he did? Was there a chance this revelation could change the outcome of the case? The courtroom grew quiet as Judge Hamilton banged his gavel to restore order. Mr. Parker, the judge began, his voice steady but stern. You have withdrawn your testimony under oath. This court will now hear your explanation for your actions and any new information you wish to present. Ethan stood, his legs slightly trembling under the weight of the moment. But his resolve remained unshaken. He had come this far. He couldn't back down now. He needed to speak the truth, no matter the cost. Your Honor, Ethan began, his voice steady as he addressed the judge. I know it might sound strange, but I think I saw something the first time that I didn't understand. Last night, after thinking it through, I remembered something more clearly. The woman in the red SUV, Linda Carter. She wasn't looking at the road when she swerved into the intersection. She was looking at something on the passenger seat. The room went silent. the gravity of Ethan's words settling on everyone. The lawyers exchanged uneasy glances. The opposing attorney, Victoria Hartwell, seemed momentarily stunned, but quickly regained her composure. Ethan could feel the weight of the courtroom's eyes on him. This was it. The truth was out in the open. "Explain further, Mr. Parker," Judge Hamilton said, his tone more patient now, but still holding authority. "What exactly was she doing?" Ethan took a deep breath. "I don't know exactly what she was looking at, Your Honor. It was just a brief moment, a split second. But I could see her head tilted down. Her hands were moving across the passenger seat, like she was distracted by something. That's when she swerved and hit Mr. Langford's car." Ethan's words hung in the air. The room was filled with a mixture of confusion and intrigue. Could this new piece of information be the breakthrough that everyone had been waiting for? Was Ethan truly right about what had happened? Victoria Hartwell stood up quickly, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "Your Honor," she said, her voice tight with disbelief, "this is highly speculative. There is no evidence to support this claim. Mr. Parker's statement is based on a memory that he has only now remembered. We cannot trust this testimony." Ethan met her gaze, unfazed. He knew what he had seen. He wasn't going to back down. "I'm not saying it's definitive," he said, his voice clear and unwavering, "but I know what I saw. I wasn't paying attention to it before, but now I know it matters." Judge Hamilton nodded thoughtfully, his eyes on Ethan. "This is significant. We will consider this new information, but it is not enough to overturn the case on its own." The judge then turned to the lawyers. "We will take a short recess while I deliberate on how to proceed with this new testimony. Mr. Parker, you may sit down for now." Ethan returned to his seat, his body aching with tension. He didn't know what would happen next, but he had done what he could. His heart pounded in his chest. Was it enough? Was there enough evidence to change the course of the trial? Outside the courtroom, Sarah, Ethan's mother, was waiting for him. She looked just as worried as she had when the trial first began. But when Ethan met her eyes, he could see something else. A flicker of hope. "How did it go?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan sighed, trying to calm his racing thoughts. "I don't know, Mom. I said what I remembered. I just hope it's enough." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, Ethan. Whatever happens, I'm proud of you." Ethan smiled faintly, but his mind was still focused on the trial. He couldn't help but wonder what Linda Carter would do next. If she was guilty, what lengths would she go to in order to protect herself? As the recess ended and the lawyers filed back into the courtroom, the judge banged his gavel, signaling the start of the next phase of the trial. "Mr. Langford's defense team," Judge Hamilton began, "we will now hear from you regarding the new testimony presented by Mr. Parker." Claudia Rogers, Robert's defense attorney, stood up, her face serious but resolute. "Your Honor, while Mr. Parker's recollection is new, we believe it supports our claim that this accident was not entirely Mr. Langford's fault. We request that the court investigate further, specifically the traffic camera footage, to verify the accuracy of Mr. Parker's memory." The judge nodded. "Very well. The court will issue a subpoena for the traffic camera footage. But be warned, this investigation will take time. We may have to delay the verdict until the footage is reviewed." Ethan sat in the gallery, trying to steady his nerves. The request for the traffic camera footage was a small victory, but it also came with its own risks. What if the footage didn't support his version of events? What if it wasn't clear enough to confirm his memory? But for now, all Ethan could do was wait. He had done everything he could. Now, it was up to the evidence to reveal the truth. The days that followed Ethan's revelation were filled with a restless tension. While the court awaited the retrieval of the traffic camera footage, the trial seemed to come to a temporary halt. The whole courtroom had shifted its focus, uncertain of what would come next. Would the footage confirm Ethan's memory? Or would it cast doubt on everything he had said? Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the outcome of the case was now entirely out of his hands. At school, Ethan's life had changed overnight. News of his testimony and the dramatic decision to withdraw it had spread like wildfire. Friends, teachers, even strangers now looked at him with a mix of awe and curiosity. Whispers followed him down the hallways, some calling him brave, others questioning his motives. "You're like a hero now, dude," Ryan Matthews, his best friend, said one day at lunch, a grin spreading across his face as he slid into the seat across from Ethan. "Everyone's talking about you." Ethan's eyes flickered with unease. "I don't know about that," he muttered, pushing his sandwich around with his fork. "I didn't want any of this. I just wanted the truth to come out." Ryan leaned in, lowering his voice. "Yeah, but what if you're wrong? What if the footage doesn't show what you think it will? What if all of this backfires?" Ethan swallowed, feeling the weight of the question. He had asked himself the same thing 100 times. What if he had misremembered the events? What if his desire for justice had led him down the wrong path? But he couldn't back down now. He had to trust what he had seen. "I'm not going to stop now," Ethan said, more to himself than to Ryan. "I just hope it's enough." At the courthouse, the legal teams were preparing for the next phase of the trial. The traffic camera footage was expected to arrive soon, but no one knew what it would reveal. Ethan could barely focus during the days leading up to its arrival. His mind was preoccupied with the uncertainty of the situation. The tension in the courtroom on the day the footage was finally presented was unlike anything Ethan had experienced before. The room was packed with reporters, legal experts, and curious onlookers, all eager to see what would happen next. The judge, his face serious, called the session to order. The clerk of the court stepped forward and placed a projector on the table. The grainy, black-and-white footage from the traffic camera at Maple and Pine was about to be played. Ethan could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the footage began. At first, the screen showed an empty intersection. Then, suddenly, a red SUV sped into view, its tires screeching as it turned the corner too fast. Ethan's eyes widened as the sedan appeared, turning cautiously into the intersection. "There!" he whispered under his breath, pointing toward the screen. The footage clearly showed Linda Carter, her head tilted down, her hands fumbling with something on the passenger seat. In that split second, the SUV veered sharply into the path of Robert Langford's sedan, causing the crash. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the sound of disbelief and astonishment filling the air. Ethan sat back in his seat, his hands clammy. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. But before anyone could celebrate, the opposing attorney, Victoria Hartwell, stood up, her voice icy with contempt. "Your Honor, this footage proves nothing," she said, shaking her head. "It doesn't show the traffic light at the time of the crash. It doesn't prove that my client, Ms. Carter, was distracted by something on the passenger seat. It's inconclusive." The judge raised a hand, silencing the room. "Enough," he said firmly. "The footage will require further analysis before it can be admitted as evidence. Court is adjourned until the review is complete." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The footage was compelling, but the battle wasn't over yet. There were still obstacles to overcome. The opposing lawyer would stop at nothing to discredit the footage, and now it was up to the court's forensic analysts to verify its authenticity. Outside the courtroom, Ethan caught a glimpse of Linda Carter, standing with her legal team. She was composed as ever, but Ethan could see the frustration in her eyes. He had no doubt that she wasn't done fighting. She was going to try every tactic in the book to make sure the truth didn't come to light. Later that evening, Ethan sat in his room, staring at the ceiling. The footage had been a major breakthrough, but the whole situation still felt fragile. What if the analysis didn't back up the footage? What if Carter's lawyers found a way to challenge it? He tried to sleep, but his mind wouldn't shut off. The anxiety gnawed at him, but he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. For the first time in weeks, it seemed like justice might actually be within reach. The following day at school, rumors about the case continued to swirl. Some students thought Ethan had already won. Others weren't so sure. The media coverage of the trial was intense, and more people were starting to take sides. Some saw Ethan as a hero, others as a naive teenager who didn't know what he was getting into. "Man, it's crazy how many people are talking about you," Ryan said, taking a seat next to Ethan at lunch. "Some people are calling you a hero. Others think you're just in over your head. What do you think?" Ethan shrugged. "I don't know. I didn't want to be in the middle of this. I just wanted the truth to come out." As the days passed, the forensic analysts worked tirelessly to review the footage. The courtroom was filled with anticipation, and when the moment finally came, the judge banged his gavel, signaling the resumption of the trial. "Your Honor," Claudia Rogers, Robert's defense attorney, stood with renewed determination. "We request that the court admit this footage as evidence. It directly supports our claim that Linda Carter was distracted at the time of the crash, and proves that my client is not at fault." The opposing attorney, Victoria Hartwell, stood once again, her expression steely. "Your Honor, we object," she said firmly. "This footage is inconclusive and unreliable. It cannot be the sole basis for determining fault in this case." Judge Hamilton raised a hand, calling for order. "This court will take the evidence under advisement," he said, "but the weight of this footage cannot be ignored. We will proceed with a full analysis before moving forward with the trial." Ethan felt a surge of relief. The footage had been a crucial turning point, and now it seemed that justice might finally be on his side. But even with the mounting evidence, he knew the fight wasn't over yet. Linda Carter wouldn't go down without a fight, and he had no idea what her next move would be. But for now, he had done what he could. And that was enough. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial entered its final stages. The forensic analysis of the traffic camera footage had confirmed what Ethan had hoped. The footage was authentic, and it showed Linda Carter's distraction at the time of the crash. The moment when she swerved into Robert Langford's path was unmistakable. Ethan could feel a small glimmer of hope beginning to grow within him. It felt like they were finally starting to get somewhere. But with each victory, another challenge seemed to emerge. Linda Carter wasn't the type of person to give up easily. In fact, Ethan had a sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. He knew from her cold, calculating demeanor in the courtroom that she would stop at nothing to protect her reputation, and more importantly, her wealth and power. The truth, no matter how clear it was, had never seemed to matter to her before. Why should it now? That evening, after a long day in court, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, going over his notes once again. His mind kept returning to the same thought. What would Linda Carter do next? He couldn't shake the feeling that, despite all the evidence stacking up against her, she wasn't done fighting. The woman had too much at stake. Sarah, his mother, entered the kitchen and sat across from him. "How are you holding up, Ethan?" she asked softly, placing a hand on his. Ethan sighed, rubbing his eyes. "I don't know, Mom. It feels like we're close, but I keep wondering if something else is going to happen. Like she's going to pull another move to try to get out of this." Sarah nodded, her brow furrowed with concern. "I know what you mean, but you've done everything you can. The truth is on your side now, and the evidence is there. Just don't let her get in your head." Ethan smiled faintly at his mom. "I'll try, Mom, but it's hard to ignore everything that's happening around me." Sarah stood up, her hand still resting on his shoulder. "You've been incredibly brave, Ethan. You've already done more than most adults would in your shoes. Whatever happens next, you've done the right thing." As Ethan watched his mother leave the room, his mind kept racing. The truth was out there. He had stood up for it. But now, with the trial nearly over, he had to face the possibility of retaliation. He had no idea what Carter's next move would be, but deep down, Ethan knew that the battle wasn't finished yet. The following day, the courtroom filled once again as the closing arguments approached. Reporters were scattered throughout, capturing every moment, every shift in momentum. The pressure was suffocating. Ethan could feel the weight of the entire trial resting on his shoulders. It was more than just the fight for Robert's innocence now. It was about standing up to a powerful woman who had used her influence to avoid accountability for far too long. As the judge prepared to call for the final verdict, Linda Carter's lawyer, Victoria Hartwell, stood up for her closing argument. Her expression was composed, her voice measured, but there was a palpable edge to it. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her eyes scanning the room, "this case has been built on speculation and conjecture. The footage, as presented, does not definitively prove that my client caused this accident. There is no clear evidence to support Mr. Langford's claims of negligence." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had feared this. Victoria's words were designed to confuse the jury, to cast doubt on the very evidence that had begun to tip the scales in Robert's favor. But then, Claudia Rogers, Robert's defense attorney, stood up. Her voice was firm and resolute as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, this is not about speculation. The evidence we've presented is clear. The footage shows the truth. Linda Carter was distracted at the time of the crash. She was looking down at something in the passenger seat, and that distraction led to the accident that has nearly destroyed Robert Langford's life." The room fell silent as Claudia's words echoed through the courtroom. "It is time for this court to deliver justice, not just for Robert Langford, but for every person who has ever been victimized by the manipulation and deceit of those with power." Ethan's heart raced as he listened to the defense's closing remarks. The truth was on their side, but it was up to the jury now to decide what to do with it. As the final arguments were delivered, the jury left the room to deliberate. Ethan sat with his head in his hands, the weight of the situation overwhelming. He had done everything he could. He had told the truth, despite the threats and the pressure. But now, he couldn't help but wonder if it would all be enough. Would the jury see the truth, or would they be swayed by Linda Carter's influence? The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. The courtroom remained eerily quiet as everyone waited for the jury to return with their verdict. The tension was suffocating, and Ethan could feel his nerves threatening to get the better of him. He glanced at his mother, who sat beside him, her face tense with worry, but filled with quiet support. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned to the courtroom. The forewoman stood up, her face serious. "We have reached a verdict," she said, her voice steady. "In the case of Langford versus Carter, we find the defendant, Robert Langford, not guilty." A wave of relief washed over Ethan as the words sunk in. The truth had won. Robert Langford was free. Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph as the courtroom erupted into murmurs and applause. It had been a long, hard fight, but they had finally succeeded. However, as Ethan glanced toward Linda Carter, sitting stone-faced at her table, he knew that this was far from the end. She may have lost the battle, but the war wasn't over. Carter's cold, calculating gaze locked onto Ethan, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she would stop at nothing to make sure he paid for exposing the truth. The courtroom erupted into chaos as the jury's verdict was read. Ethan sat frozen in his chair, barely able to comprehend the words. Not guilty. Robert Langford was free. The relief hit him like a wave, but it didn't last long. Even as the applause and murmurs of approval swelled in the background, Ethan's eyes were locked on Linda Carter. She was seated at her table, stone-faced, her eyes narrowed into cold slits. A flicker of anger flashed across her expression before it was replaced with an unreadable calm. Ethan knew, without a doubt, that this was far from over. The woman was powerful, and this trial, while a victory, hadn't been a complete defeat for her. She still had resources, and she wouldn't simply walk away from her tarnished reputation. Ethan shifted in his seat, his heart still racing from the tension of the trial. It felt like the victory was hanging in the balance, fragile, like it could break at any moment. As the judge called for the end of the session, the room slowly emptied, the energy leaving with the crowd. But in that quiet, Ethan felt a gnawing unease. The worst had been avoided for now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Outside the courthouse, Ethan and his mother, Sarah, made their way through the crowd of reporters and curious onlookers. Cameras flashed in their faces as reporters shouted questions, trying to get a soundbite from the teenage witness who had taken down a wealthy businesswoman. But Ethan couldn't focus on them. He kept glancing back over his shoulder, half expecting Linda Carter to appear with her cold, calculating smile. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. Ethan nodded, though he didn't feel okay. "Yeah, I think so. It's just, I don't know. She's not done with us. I can feel it." Sarah placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You did what you had to do, Ethan. The truth came out. Robert's free because of you." Ethan managed a weak smile. "Yeah, but I'm worried about what's next. What if she tries to take revenge on us?" As they made their way to the car, Ethan's stomach twisted with anxiety. He couldn't shake the image of Linda Carter's cold, emotionless eyes. She was dangerous. And now, with the case over, her focus would turn to making sure no one ever questioned her again. That night, after a long, restless evening, Ethan's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, expecting it to be his best friend Ryan or some random update. But when he saw the message, his heart skipped a beat. The message was from an unknown number, the text reading, "You think you've won? Think again. This isn't over." Ethan's fingers went numb as he stared at the screen. His throat tightened. He didn't need to look at his mother to know that this was just the beginning. Linda Carter wasn't going to let him get away with exposing her. She had power, and she had a way of making people disappear. Panic rose in his chest, but he forced it down. He couldn't let fear control him. He'd come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. "Ethan," Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. "What's wrong?" Ethan handed her the phone without a word. Sarah's face went pale as she read the message, her hand trembling slightly. "This is serious," she said quietly. "We need to report this to the police. Now." The next morning, they went to the local police station, where they were greeted by Officer Riley, a no-nonsense detective who had been following the case from the beginning. When Ethan showed her the message, Riley's expression hardened. "This kind of intimidation isn't something we take lightly," Riley said, her voice firm. "We'll start an investigation into the source of the message, and we'll do everything we can to protect you." Despite her reassuring words, Ethan couldn't shake the gnawing fear in his stomach. Linda Carter had just lost her battle in court, but that didn't mean she would give up. He knew she was capable of anything. The next few days were a blur. Ethan kept a close eye on his surroundings, constantly looking over his shoulder. Sarah did the same, her worry mounting as strange things started happening. One evening, when Ethan was walking home from a friend's house, he saw a black car parked across the street from his house. The tinted windows made it impossible to see inside, but the car sat there for hours, not moving. Ethan's heart raced. "Mom," he said, his voice shaking, "there's a car parked across the street. It's been there all night." Sarah looked out the window, her face pale. "That's not good," she said softly. "Stay inside, Ethan. We'll call the police again." Ethan did as she asked, but his mind raced. Was it a coincidence? Or was Linda Carter behind it all? He couldn't help but feel the weight of the danger that hung over them. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was personal. The next morning, Sarah sat Ethan down at the kitchen table. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice serious. "The police have traced the number that sent you that text message. It's coming from an unregistered burner phone. They're still working on finding out who's behind it, but they don't know for sure, right?" Ethan finished for her, his stomach turning. Sarah nodded. "I'm afraid so. But we're going to stay vigilant. We'll figure this out, Ethan. We're not going to let her win." But even as Sarah spoke, Ethan knew they were in more danger than ever. Linda Carter was still out there, and if she was as ruthless as he feared, she wouldn't stop until she had silenced them once and for all. Days passed, but the tension in Ethan's life only grew. The court case was over. Robert Langford had been acquitted, and Linda Carter had lost. Yet, despite the apparent victory, the shadow of Linda Carter's influence loomed over Ethan and his family like a storm that refused to pass. The police investigation into the text message was still ongoing, but there had been no breakthroughs. Officer Riley, though determined, had warned them that this kind of threat could take time to trace, especially when it came from an untraceable burner phone. In the meantime, Ethan had to adjust to a life of constant vigilance. One evening, as Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table with his mother, there was a sudden knock at the door. His heart skipped a beat. They weren't expecting anyone. Sarah, already looking tense, motioned for Ethan to stay back as she approached the door. She opened it slowly, revealing a young woman standing on the porch, her eyes darting nervously around as if she was being followed. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked, her voice wary but polite. The woman hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice trembling. "My name's Rachel. I need to talk to Ethan. It's about the case." Ethan stood up, his curiosity piqued. This was the first time anyone had shown up unannounced, and the mention of the case immediately grabbed his attention. He walked over to the door, studying the woman. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with a nervous energy that suggested she was on edge. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked as Rachel stepped inside. "What's this about?" Rachel quickly glanced around, as if checking to make sure they were alone. Then she sat down on the couch, her hands fidgeting in her lap. I was there that day, at the intersection. I saw what happened." Ethan's breath caught in his chest. "You were there?" he asked, his voice a mix of surprise and urgency. "Why didn't you come forward before?" Rachel swallowed hard, her face pale. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I used to work for Linda Carter. I was her personal assistant. I handled her emails, her schedule, everything. I know how dangerous she is. If I said anything, I knew what could happen. People who cross her don't get away with it." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "You worked for her?" he repeated, his mind racing. Why are you telling us this now? Rachel looked up, her eyes filled with fear. Because I can't stay silent anymore. She's done things, bad things, to cover her tracks. This isn't the first time she's caused an accident and twisted the story to make it someone else's fault. I know this isn't the only time she's been involved in something like this. I had to leave her company when I realized how far she would go. Ethan was stunned. He had never considered the possibility that Linda Carter had done this before. How do you know all of this? Is there any proof? Rachel hesitated, glancing around nervously. I saved some things. Emails, memos, documents. I kept them on a flash drive. I didn't want to get caught, but I knew it was only a matter of time before someone needed the truth. Ethan's heart raced. Do you have it with you? Can we see it? Rachel nodded, pulling a small flash drive from her pocket. She handed it to Ethan, her hands shaking slightly. I didn't want to get involved, but I can't let her hurt anyone else. The truth needs to come out. As Ethan took the flash drive, his mind was already racing. If Rachel's story was true, this could be the breakthrough they needed. This evidence could not only prove Linda Carter's involvement in the accident, but expose a pattern of manipulation and deceit that could bring her to justice. Thank you, Rachel, Ethan said, his voice filled with gratitude and awe. This could change everything. Rachel looked exhausted, her eyes filled with fear. I'm doing this for Robert, for the people she's hurt. I just hope it's enough. The next day, Ethan and Sarah met with Robert's lawyer, Claudia Rogers, at a local diner to go over the flash drive. As they sat down, Claudia immediately began reviewing the files with growing astonishment. The documents were damning. Emails between Linda Carter and her legal team, memos discussing tactics to manipulate witnesses, and a series of threats toward anyone who might stand in her way. It was all there. This is incredible, Claudia said, her voice trembling with emotion. If we can verify the authenticity of these documents, this could dismantle Linda Carter's entire case. It could destroy her credibility completely. Sarah, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. What about Rachel? Will she have to testify? Claudia nodded grimly. Yes. If we present this evidence in court, we'll need her to testify under oath. But that's the tricky part. Carter's team will do everything they can to discredit her, and Rachel could be in danger if they find out she's the one who provided this information. Rachel, who had been sitting quietly at the table, nodded. I'm ready to testify. I've seen enough to know that this woman has no conscience. If I don't do this now, I'll never forgive myself. The weight of what Rachel was agreeing to hung in the air. Testifying against Linda Carter would put her directly in the line of fire. But she was determined, her resolve as strong as Ethan's. The truth needed to come out, no matter the cost. The next day, the court was filled with anticipation. The evidence from the flash drive was presented to the judge, and the room buzzed with murmurs as the extent of Linda Carter's manipulation became clear. It wasn't just about the accident anymore. This was about exposing a pattern of criminal behavior, a history of using her power to silence anyone who dared to speak out. Linda Carter's lawyer stood up, trying to fight back. Your Honor, he said, his voice laced with disdain. These documents are baseless and unsubstantiated. We demand a thorough investigation into their authenticity before they are admitted as evidence. Claudia Rogers, her voice steady and forceful, replied, The authenticity of these documents is beyond question. They paint a clear picture of Linda Carter's involvement in illegal activity, and it's time for her to be held accountable for her actions. The judge looked at the documents carefully, his expression unreadable. I will allow a recess for further verification of this evidence. We will reconvene tomorrow for a full review. Ethan could feel his pulse racing. This was it. The pieces were falling into place. Linda Carter's empire of lies and manipulation was beginning to crumble, and Ethan had played a pivotal role in bringing it all to light. But even as the judge called for the recess, Ethan knew the fight was far from over. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the session resumed the following day. The judge had allowed for a recess to verify the authenticity of the documents Rachel had provided, and now the entire room was on edge. Everyone knew that this was the moment that could finally bring down Linda Carter, but it was still unclear how the judge would rule. The documents Rachel had given them painted a damning picture of Carter's manipulations, but there was always the possibility that her legal team would find a way to discredit them. Ethan sat nervously with his mother in the gallery, clutching the edge of the seat. The weight of the situation felt heavier than ever. This wasn't just about Robert Langford's freedom anymore. It was about something far larger, exposing a powerful woman who had used her wealth and influence to bully, intimidate, and ruin the lives of anyone who stood in her way. Rachel, sitting beside them, looked just as nervous, but there was a quiet determination in her eyes. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Her life had already been turned upside down once by Linda Carter. This time, Rachel wasn't going to let the truth be buried. "Ethan," Sarah whispered, leaning in closer. "Are you okay?" Ethan nodded, though the anxiety was visible in his eyes. "I don't know, Mom. I just feel like, what if it's not enough? What if Linda finds a way out of this?" Sarah squeezed his hand. "You've done more than anyone could have asked of you. The truth is out there now, and it's all thanks to you and Rachel. We're almost there." The courtroom doors opened, and the judge returned to the bench, signaling the start of the session. The tension in the room escalated as everyone settled into their seats. Linda Carter's lawyer, Vincent Mallory, stood up, adjusting his glasses with a quiet confidence that suggested he was already preparing his counter-arguments. The judge spoke first. "I have reviewed the documents presented by the defense, as well as the testimony given by Ms. Rachel Simmons. The evidence is compelling, and I find that there is sufficient cause to proceed with the charges against Ms. Carter. However, I must allow both parties one final chance to present their arguments before we move to closing statements." Mallory's face tightened, but he quickly composed himself. "Your Honor, we maintain that these documents are a fabrication, that they are being used in an attempt to manipulate this court and derail the true cause of this trial." Claudia Rogers stood up with quiet authority. "Your Honor, these documents are authentic, and they show a pattern of deceit, intimidation, and obstruction. Ms. Carter's actions have been an affront to justice, and we now have the evidence to prove it. We ask that the court take this evidence into full consideration when delivering its verdict." The judge nodded. "Thank you. We will proceed with closing statements after a short recess. Court is adjourned for now." Ethan and Sarah stood, silently making their way out of the courtroom. The pressure had only increased with the new revelations. Every move felt critical now. As they walked through the halls, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Linda Carter was planning her next move. Despite the mounting evidence, he could sense she wouldn't go down without a fight. That evening, as the family sat in their living room, Ethan's phone buzzed again. His heart skipped a beat as he checked the message. It was from the same unknown number. "You think you've won? You have no idea what I'm capable of. Stay out of this, or you'll regret it." Ethan's stomach sank. This time, the message was even more threatening than before. His heart raced as he looked up at his mother. "It's her again, Mom. Linda. She's not giving up." Sarah's face hardened. "We need to take this to the police, Ethan. She's not going to intimidate us. We've come too far." The next morning, they met with Officer Riley, who listened intently to their concerns. "This is escalating," Riley said, her expression grim. "We'll start an investigation into these messages, but we need to be cautious. People like Linda Carter don't just let things go. If she's behind this, she'll use everything she has to scare you into silence. But we'll do our best to protect you." Ethan wasn't sure if he felt reassured or even more afraid. Linda Carter's threats had gone beyond just text messages. They had become personal. Ethan had no illusions about how far she was willing to go to protect her power. Later that afternoon, Ethan was on his way home from school when he saw a black car parked outside his house. The same car he had seen weeks ago. This time, though, it was different. The driver was inside, and Ethan could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that car. He knew what it meant. He turned to walk inside quickly, but as he reached for the door, he saw a shadow move in his peripheral vision. A figure stepped out from the car, and Ethan froze. The man was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his face obscured by the glare of the car's tinted windows. He took a few slow steps toward Ethan before stopping. His cold, deliberate voice carried across the driveway. "Ethan Parker," he said, his tone smooth but unsettling. "We need to talk. This is your last chance. Stay out of this case. You don't want to see what happens if you don't." Ethan's stomach churned. He recognized the man. He had been at the courthouse the day of the trial, the one who had been watching from the distance. "I'm not going to back down," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up his spine. The man's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "You should have listened." Before Ethan could respond, the man turned and walked back to the black car. The door slammed shut, and the car sped off, disappearing into the distance. Ethan stood frozen, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. This wasn't over. If anything, it had only just begun. That night, as the family sat down to dinner, the phone rang. Sarah picked it up, her face going pale as she listened. She slowly lowered the receiver and looked at Ethan. "Ethan, they've found the car. The black car," she said, her voice trembling. "It was rented by a private investigator who works for Linda Carter." Ethan's blood ran cold. They were being watched, and Linda Carter was going to do everything in her power to make sure they regretted ever standing up to her. The following days passed in a blur of uncertainty and fear. The truth had been exposed. The documents Rachel had provided, coupled with her brave decision to testify, had painted a damning portrait of Linda Carter's manipulation and deceit. But despite the victory in court, the victory over Linda Carter herself still felt fragile, as though the battle wasn't truly over. Ethan, his family, and even Robert Langford now faced an invisible war against a woman with resources, connections, and a determination to never be defeated. The black car had been a clear message. Linda Carter wasn't finished, and she wouldn't stop until she had silenced everyone who had dared to challenge her. Ethan couldn't shake the fear that lingered in his chest. Linda's private investigator had already been identified, but the threat was still there. The police had been more vigilant than ever, but Ethan's nerves were stretched thin. He could no longer go to school without looking over his shoulder, or return home without wondering if today would be the day she made her next move. The tension that had started in the courtroom now bled into every aspect of his life. He tried to focus on his studies, but his mind kept wandering back to Linda Carter. He had thought that the truth alone would be enough, but now he realized that the truth was only the beginning. One evening, a week after the confrontation with the man in the black car, Ethan sat at the dinner table with his mother. She was trying her best to keep things normal, but the strain on her face told Ethan all he needed to know. They were living in a constant state of fear, and he hated it. He hated that it had come to this. He had done the right thing. He had exposed Linda Carter's lies. But now, they were all paying the price. The doorbell rang, pulling him from his thoughts. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Who could it be at this hour? Sarah hesitated before standing up, her hand going instinctively to the phone in her pocket. Ethan stood up quickly and followed her to the door. When Sarah opened it, she froze. Standing on the porch, looking tired and disheveled, was Rachel. Her eyes were red, her clothes wrinkled as though she hadn't slept in days. "Rachel?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with surprise and concern. "What are you doing here?" "I had to come," Rachel said, her voice trembling. I don't know how much time I have. I need to tell you everything." Ethan's heart sank as he watched Rachel walk into their home. Something about her demeanor, the panic in her eyes, made him uneasy. She was in trouble, and it was clear she had nowhere else to turn. "What's going on?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but filled with worry. I didn't want to get you involved in this," Rachel began, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "But they're coming for me. They know I'm the one who gave you the evidence, and now they want to make sure I don't talk. I don't know what else to do." Ethan's stomach tightened. "Who's coming for you? Linda Carter?" Rachel nodded, her face pale. "Yes, she's made it clear. If I testify again, if I speak out against her, I won't be safe. I can't live like this anymore." Ethan's thoughts raced. Linda Carter had already done everything in her power to manipulate the situation. She had used threats, intimidation, and money to silence those who stood in her way. Now, she was after Rachel. "You're not alone," Ethan said, his voice firm. "We'll get through this together. We've already exposed her lies. Now we just need to make sure she faces the consequences." Rachel looked at him, her eyes filled with both fear and gratitude. "But what if it's too late?" she whispered. The doorbell rang again, this time more insistently. Sarah walked to the door, her face going pale as she looked through the peephole. She turned back to Ethan, her voice shaking. "It's the police. Officer Riley." Ethan rushed to the door, his heart pounding. As the door opened, Officer Riley stepped inside, her expression grim. "Ethan, Sarah," Riley said, her voice low. "We've been investigating Linda Carter's activities, and it looks like she's made her next move. We've got reason to believe that she's planning something big, something that could put all of you in danger. We need to move quickly." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, feeling the weight of the situation crashing down on him. Riley hesitated before speaking. "We've confirmed that Linda Carter has been orchestrating a smear campaign against you and your family. She's trying to turn public opinion against you. She's even gone so far as to hire a group of private investigators to track you. We need to take this seriously. You're all targets now." Ethan's stomach churned. Linda Carter wasn't just trying to protect her reputation. She was trying to ruin theirs. She was making sure they paid for everything they had exposed. "I need you to come with me," Riley continued, her voice firm. "We've arranged for you to be relocated temporarily. It's not safe here anymore. We can't guarantee your safety if you stay." Rachel, standing by the door, looked like she was about to break down. "I didn't want this to happen," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted anyone to be hurt." Ethan took a deep breath, looking at his mother, then at Rachel. "We can't let her win," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "We've come too far. We won't back down now." As they left the house, Ethan felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The fight wasn't over. But as he looked at Rachel and his mother, he knew that together They would face whatever came next. They had exposed the truth. And no matter what Linda Carter did to stop them, that truth would never be silenced. The truth had won the battle, but the war was still raging.